Be stable when the same content has been coded multiple times by the same person, with the same result each time. If you discover problems of instability in your coding procedures, it is possible that your coding rules are ambiguous and need to be clarified. Ambiguities in the text itself might also contribute to problems of stability. While you cannot alter your original textual data sources, simply being aware of possible ambiguities in the data as you code may help reduce the likelihood of problems with stability. It is also possible that problems with stability may result from a simple coding error, such as inadvertently jotting a E instead of a sh on your code sheet. Reproducibility, sometimes referred to as intercoder reliability, Lombard, Snyder, Dutch, and Campanella Bracken, 2010-25 is the extent to which one's coding procedures will result in the same results when the same text is coded by different people. Cognitive differences among the individual's coding data may result in problems with reproducibility, as could ambiguous coding instructions. Random coding errors might also cause problems. One way of overcoming problems of reproducibility is to have coders code together. While working as a graduate research assistant, I participated in a content analysis project in which 4 individuals shared the responsibility for coding data. To reduce the potential for reproducibility problems with our coding, we conducted our coding at the same time in the same room, while sitting around a large round table. We coded at the same time in the same room so that we could consult one another when we ran into problems or had questions about what we were coding. Resolving those ambiguities together meant that we grew to have a shared understanding of how to code various bits of data. Finally, accuracy refers to the extent to which one's coding procedures correspond to some pre-existing standard. This presumes that a standard coding strategy has already been established for whatever text you're reanalyzing. It may not be the case that official standards have been set, but perusing the prior literature for the collective wisdom on coding on your particular area is time well spent. Scholarship focused on similar data or coding procedures will no doubt help you to clarify and improve your own coding procedures. Key takeaways. Stability can become an issue in unobtrusive research project when the results of coding by the same person vary across different time periods. Reproducibility has to do with multiple coders' results being the same for the same text. Accuracy refers to the extent to which one's coding procedures correspond to some pre-existing standard. 25. Lombard, M. Snyder, Dutch, J. and Campanella Bracken, C. 2004. Practical resources for assessing and reporting intercoder reliability in content analysis research projects. Retrieved from http://astro.temple.edu/Lombard reliability. Chapter 11 218. Exercise 1. With a peer, create a code sheet that you can use to record instances of violence on the television program of your choice. Now, on your own, watch 2 or 3 episodes of that program, coding for instances of violence as you go along. Your peer should do the same. Finally, compare your code sheet to that of your peer. How similar were you in your coding? Where do your coding results differ, and why? Which issues of reliability may be relevant?
219
Chapter 12 Other Methods of Data Collection and Analysis
12.1 Why additional methods?
Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC-SA 4.0 While the data collection methods described thus far in the text may be among the most commonly used in sociology, they certainly are not the only methods that social scientists use. Here we'll describe some of the other methods used in social science, including focus groups, experiments, and ethnomethodology and conversation analysis.
12年1月1日 Focus Groups
Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License,
http://
Creative Commons org licenses by NC-SA 4.0 Learning Objectives
1.
Define focus groups and outline how they differ from one-on-one interviews.
2.
Discuss how different groups have used focus groups for different purposes.
3.
Identify the strengths and weaknesses of focus group methodology.
4.
Describe how to determine the best size for focus groups.
5.
Identify the major considerations in focus group composition.
6.
Discuss how to moderate focus groups. Focus groups resemble qualitative interviews in that a researcher may prepare an interview guide in advance and interact with participants by asking them questions. But anyone who has conducted both one-on-one interviews and focus groups knows that each is unique. In an interview, usually one member, the research participant, is most active while the other, the researcher, plays the role of listener, conversation guider, and question asker. Focus groups, on the other hand, are planned discussions designed to elicit group interaction and obtain perceptions on a defined area of interest in a permissive, non-threatening environment. Kruger and Casey,
2000, p.
1. In this case, the researcher may play a less active role than in a one-on-one interview.
1.
Kruger, R.A., and Casey, M.A.
2000.
Focus Groups, A Practical Guide for Applied Research, 3rd ed. Thousand Oaks, C.A. Sage. Chapter
12 220.
The researcher's aim is to get participants talking to each other and to observe interactions among participants. Focus groups are typically more dynamic than interviews. The researcher takes the role of moderator, posing questions or topics for discussion, but then lets the group members discuss the question or topic among themselves. Participants may ask each other follow-up questions, agree or disagree with one another, display body language that tells us something about their feelings about the conversation, or even come up with questions not previously conceived of by the researcher. It is just these sorts of interactions and displays that are of interest to the researcher. A researcher conducting focus groups collects data on more than people as direct responses to her or his questions. The group interaction is a key focal point. Due to the nature and unpredictability of group interaction, and the fact that focus group researchers generally want to draw out group interaction, focus groups tend to be qualitative rather than quantitative. There are numerous examples of sociological research using focus group methodology. In their 2008 study, for example, Amy Slater and Marika Tigerman, 2010 conducted 6 focus groups with 49 adolescent girls between the ages of 13 and 15 to learn more about girls' attitudes toward their own and other girls' participation in sports. In order to get focus group participants to speak with one another rather than with the group facilitator, the study's interview guide contained just 2 questions. Can you tell me some of the reasons that girls stop playing sports or other physical activities, and why do you think girls don't play as much sport physical activity as boys? In another focus group study, by Ilana and Angie Williams, 2009, 3 held 9 focus group sessions with adults of different ages to gauge their perceptions of how older characters are represented in television commercials. Among other considerations, the researchers were interested in discovering how focus group participants position themselves and others in terms of age stereotypes and identities during the group discussion. In both examples, the researchers' core interest in group interaction could not have been assessed had interviews been conducted on a one-on-one basis, thus the focus group method was the ideal choice. In each instance, the preceding examples come from the work of academics who have used focus groups as their method of data collection. But focus groups have proven quite useful for those outside of academia as well. In fact, this method is especially popular among applied researchers. Market researchers use focus groups to gather information about the products or services they aim to sell. Government officials and political campaign workers use them to learn how members of the public feel about a particular issue or candidate. One of the earliest documented uses of focus groups comes from World War II, when researchers used them to assess the effectiveness of troop training materials and of various propaganda efforts. Merton and Kendall, 1946. Morgan, 1997. Market researchers quickly adopted this method of collecting data to learn about human beliefs and behaviors. Within social science, the use of focus Slater, A. and Tigerman, M. 2010. On Cool to Do Sport, a focus group study of adolescent girls' reasons for withdrawing from physical activity. Psychology of Sport and Exercise, 11, 619-626. 3. Ilana, V. and Williams, A. 2009. Positioning Age, focus group discussions about older people in TV advertising. International Journal of the Sociology of Language, 200, 171-187. 4. Morgan, D.L. 1997. Focus Groups as Qualitative Research, R&D ed. Thousand Oaks, C.A. Sage, reference for Merton and Kendall, 1946, missing in original. 221. Groups did not really take off until the 1980s, when demographers and communication researchers began to appreciate their use in understanding knowledge, attitudes, and communication. Morgan, 1997. 5. Focus groups share many of the strengths and weaknesses of one-on-one qualitative interviews. Both methods can yield very detailed, in-depth information, are excellent for studying social processes, and provide researchers with an opportunity not only to hear what participants say but also to observe what they do in terms of their body language. Focus groups offer the added benefit of giving researchers a chance to collect data on human interaction by observing how group participants respond and react to one another. Like one-on-one qualitative interviews, focus groups can also be quite expensive and time-consuming. However, there may be some time savings with focus groups as it takes fewer group events than one-on-one interviews to gather data from the same number of people. Another potential drawback of focus groups, which is not a concern for one-on-one interviews, is that one or two participants might dominate the group, silencing other participants. Careful planning and skillful moderation on the part of the researcher are crucial for avoiding, or at least dealing with, such possibilities. The various strengths and weaknesses of focus group research are summarized in Table 12.1. Strengths, weaknesses. Yield detailed, in-depth data expensive. Less time consuming than one-on-one interviews. May be more time consuming than survey research. Useful for studying social processes. Minority of participants may dominate entire group. Allow researchers to observe body language in addition to self-reports. Allow researchers to observe interaction between multiple participants. Table 12.1. Strengths and weaknesses of focus group research. As mentioned, careful planning and skillful moderating are two crucial considerations in the effective use of focus groups as a method of data collection. In some ways, focus groups require more advanced planning than other qualitative methods of data. 5. Morgan, D.L. 1997. Focus groups as qualitative research, R&D at Thousand Oaks, CA, Sage. Chapter 12-222. Collections such as one-on-one interviews, where a researcher may be better able to control the setting and the dialogue, or field research, where going with the flow and observing events as they happen in their natural setting is the primary aim and time is less limited. Researchers must take care to form focus groups whose members will want to interact with one another and to control the timing of the event so that participants are not asked nor expected to stay for a longer time than they've agreed to participate. The researcher should also be prepared to inform focus group participants of their responsibility to maintain the confidentiality of what is said in the group. But while the researcher can and should encourage all focus group members to maintain confidentiality, she should also clarify to participants that the unique nature of the group setting prevents her from being able to promise that confidentiality will be maintained. Group size should be determined in part by the topic of the interview and your sense of the likelihood that participants will have much to say without much prompting. If the topic is one about which you think participants feel passionately and will have much to say, I think a group of 3到5 is ideal. Groups larger than that, especially for heated topics, can easily become unmanageable. Some recommend that a group of about 6到10 participants is the ideal size for focus group research. Morgan, 1997, 6. Others recommend that groups should include 3到12 participants, Adler and Clark, 2008. The size of the focus group is ultimately your decision as the researcher. When forming groups and deciding how large or small to make them, take into consideration what you know about the topic and participants' potential interest in, passion for, and feelings about the topic. Also consider your comfort level and experience in conducting focus groups. These factors will help you decide which size is right in your particular case. It may seem counterintuitive, but in general, it is better to form focus groups consisting of participants who do not know one another than to create groups consisting of friends, relatives, or acquaintances. Agar and McDonald, 1995. The reason for this is that groups who know each other may share some taken for granted knowledge or assumptions. In sociological research, it is precisely the taken for granted that is often of interest. Thus, the focus group researcher should avoid setting up interactions where participants may be discouraged to question or raise issues that they take for granted. However, groups should not be so heterogeneous that participants will be unlikely to feel comfortable talking with one another. Focus group researchers must carefully consider the composition of the groups they put together. In his text on conducting focus groups, Morgan suggests that homogeneity in background and not homogeneity in attitudes, p. 36, should be the goal, since participants must feel comfortable speaking up but must also have enough differences to facilitate a productive discussion. 1997. Whatever composition a researcher designs for her or his focus groups, the important point to keep in mind is that focus group dynamics are shaped by multiple social contexts. Hollander, 2004. 10. Participants' silences as well as their speech may be shaped by gender, race, class. 6. Morgan, D.L. 1997. Focus groups as qualitative research, R&D ed. Thousand Oaks, C.A., Sage. 7. Adler, E.S., and Clark, R. 2008. How it is done, an invitation to social research, 3 R.D. ed. Belmont, C.A., Thomson Wadsworth. 8. Agar, M., and McDonald, J. 1995. Focus Groups and Ethnography. Human Organization, 54, 78-86. 9. Morgan, D.L. 1997. Focus Groups as Qualitative Research, R&D ed. Thousand Oaks, C.A., Sage. 10. Hollander, J.A. 2004. The Social Context of Focus Groups. Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, 33, 602-637. 223. Sexuality, age, or other background characteristics or social dynamics, all of which might be suppressed or exacerbated depending on the composition of the group. Hollander suggests that researchers must pay careful attention to group composition, must be attentive to group dynamics during the focus group discussion, and should triangulate multiple methods of data collection in order to untangle participants' responses and their relationship to the social contexts of the focus group. p. 632. In addition to the importance of advanced planning, focus groups also require skillful moderation. While a researcher certainly doesn't want to be viewed as a stick in the mud or as overly domineering, it is important to set ground rules for focus groups at the outset of the discussion. Remind participants that you've invited them to participate because you want to hear from all of them. Therefore, the group should aim to let just one person speak at a time and avoid letting just a couple of participants dominate the conversation. One way to do this is to begin the discussion by asking participants to briefly introduce themselves or to provide a brief response to an opening question. This will help set the tone of having all group members participate. Also ask participants to avoid having side conversations, sharing thoughts about or reactions to what is said in the group is important and should not be limited to only a few group members. As the focus group gets rolling, the moderator will play a less active role than he does in a one-on-one interview. There may be times when the conversation stagnates or when you, as moderator, wish to guide the conversation in another direction. In these instances, it is important to demonstrate that you've been paying attention to what participants have said. Being prepared to interject statements or questions such as I'd really like to hear more about what Sally and Joe think about what Dominic and Ashley have been saying, or several of you have mentioned. What do others think about this will be important for keeping the conversation going. It can also help redirect the conversation, shift the focus to participants who have been less active in the group, and serve as a cue to those who may be dominating the conversation that it is time to allow others to speak. In sum, focus groups are a useful method for researchers who wish to gather in-depth information about social processes. Focus groups are similar to one-on-one qualitative interviews in many ways, but they give researchers the opportunity to observe group dynamics that cannot be observed in one-on-one interviews. Historically, focus group research was more commonly used by applied researchers than by academics, though. In recent decades, social scientists from all domains have discovered the usefulness of focus groups for gaining understanding of social processes and have begun using this method of data collection in their studies. Key takeaways. Focus groups are designed to elicit group interaction. Focus groups are used in a variety of professions, from market research to academia to government and political research. Like one-on-one qualitative interviews, focus groups can yield very detailed information, are excellent for studying social processes. Chapter 12 and provide researchers with an opportunity to observe participants' body language. They also allow researchers to observe human interaction. Focus groups can be expensive and time-consuming, as are one-on-one interviews. There is also the possibility that a few participants will dominate the group and silence others in the group. In terms of focus group composition, homogeneity of background among participants is recommended while diverse attitudes within the group are ideal. Exercises. Musician John Mayer held a focus group to get fan feedback on his career. Watch and critique his focus group facilitation style in this clip. http://www.youtube.com/watch_feature_player_。 EMBEDDED 和 V 等于 ES3W Flow PGM. How well does Meyer play the role of a behind the scenes focus group moderator? How well does he get focus group participants to talk with each other? Knowing what you now know about interviews and focus group research, what advice would you give Meyer for improving his focus group facilitation skills? To see what a real marketing focus group looks like, watch the following video. http://www.youtube.com/watch_feature_player EMBEDDED 和 V 等于 MUII7BFHQL4ULLC. Several of the tips mentioned in this section applied. As you watch, what elements of the major strengths and weaknesses of focus group research seem to be in play? 12年1月2日 Experiments. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 4.0 International License, http://Creative Commons org licenses by NC SA 4.0 Learning Objectives. Define experiment. Distinguish true experiments from pre-experimental designs. 3. Identify the core features of true experimental designs. 4. Describe the difference between an experimental group and a control group. 5. Identify and describe the various types of true experimental designs. 225. 6. Identify and describe the various types of pre-experimental designs. 7. Name the key strengths and weaknesses of experiments. 8. Define internal validity and external validity. Experiments are an excellent data collection strategy for those wishing to observe the consequences of very specific actions or stimuli. Most commonly a quantitative research method, experiments are used more often by psychologists than sociologists, but understanding what experiments are and how they are conducted is useful for all social scientists, whether they actually plan to use this methodology or simply aim to understand findings based on experimental designs. An experiment is a method of data collection designed to test hypotheses under controlled conditions. Students in my research methods classes often use the term experiment to describe all kinds of empirical research projects, but in social scientific research, the term has a unique meaning and should not be used to describe all research methodologies. Several kinds of experimental designs exist. In general, designs considered to be true experiments contain 3 key features: independent and dependent variables, pre-testing and post-testing, and experimental and control groups. In the classic experiment, the effect of a stimulus is tested by comparing 2 groups, one that is exposed to the stimulus, the experimental group, and another that does not receive the stimulus, the control group. In other words, the effects of an independent variable upon a dependent variable are tested. Because the researcher's interest lies in the effects of an independent variable, she must measure participants on the dependent variable before and after the independent variable, or stimulus, is administered. Thus pre-testing and post-testing are both important steps in a classic experiment. One example of experimental research can be found in Shannon K. McCoy and Brenda Major's 2003-11 Study of People as Perceptions of Prejudice. In one portion of this multifaceted study, all participants were given a pretest to assess their levels of depression. No significant differences in depression were found between the experimental and control groups during the pretest. Participants in the experimental group were then asked to read an article suggesting that prejudice against their own racial group is severe and pervasive, while participants in the control group were asked to read an article suggesting that prejudice against a racial group other than their own is severe and pervasive. Upon measuring depression scores during the post-test period, the researchers discovered that those who had received the experimental stimulus, the article citing prejudice against their same racial group, reported greater depression than those in the control group. This is just one of many examples of social scientific experimental research. In addition to the classic experimental design, there are two other ways of designing experiments that are considered to fall within the purview of true experiments. Babi, 2010, Campbell and Stanley, 1963. 12. They are the Solomon 4, Group Design. 11. McCoy, S.K., and Major, B. 2003. Group Identification Moderates Emotional Response to Perceived Prejudice, Personality, and Social Psychology Bulletin, 29, 1005-1017. 12. Babi, E. 2010. The Practice of Social Research, 12 ed. Belmont, C.A., Wadsworth, Campbell, D., and Stanley, J. 1963. Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Research. Chicago, I.L., Rand McNally. Chapter 12 226. And the post-test, only control group design. In the former, 4 groups exist. 2 groups are treated as they would be in a classic experiment. Another group receives the stimulus and is then given the post-test. The remaining group does not receive the stimulus but is given the post-test. Table 12.2 illustrates the features of each of the 4 groups in the Solomon 4 group design. Pretest stimulus, post-test no stimulus. Group EXXX. Group RXXX. Group 3XX. Group 4XX. Table 12.2 Solomon 4 group design. Finally, the post-test only control group is also considered a true experimental design, though it lacks any pretest group. In this design, participants are assigned to either an experimental or a control group. Individuals are then measured on some dependent variable following the administration of an experimental stimulus to the experimental group. In theory, as long as the control and experimental groups have been determined randomly, no pretest is needed. Time, other resources such as funding, and even one as topic may limit a researcher's ability to conduct a true experiment. For researchers in the medical and health sciences, conducting a true experiment could require denying needed treatment to patients, which is a clear ethical violation. Even those whose research may not involve the administration of needed medications or treatments may be limited in their ability to conduct a classic experiment. In social scientific experiments, for example, it might not be equitable or ethical to provide a large financial or other reward only to members of the experimental group, When random assignment of participants into experimental and control groups is not feasible, researchers may turn to a pre-experimental design. Campbell and Stanley, 1963. 13. However, this type of design comes with some unique disadvantages, which we'll describe as we review the pre-experimental designs available. If we wish to measure the impact of some natural disaster, for example, Hurricane Katrina, we might conduct a pre-experiment by identifying an experimental group from a community that experienced the hurricane and a control group from a similar community that had not been hit by the hurricane. This study design, called a static group comparison, has the advantage of including a comparison control group that did not experience the stimulus, in this case, the hurricane, but the disadvantage of containing experimental and control groups that were determined by a factor or 13. Campbell, D. and Stanley, J. 1963. Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Research. Chicago, I.L., Rand McNally. 227. Factors other than random assignment. As you might have guessed from our example, static group comparisons are useful in cases where a researcher cannot control or predict whether, when, or how the stimulus is administered, as in the case of natural disasters. In cases where the administration of the stimulus is quite costly or otherwise not possible, a one-shot case study design might be used. In this instance, no pretest is administered, nor is a control group present. In our example of the study of the impact of Hurricane Katrina, a researcher using this design would test the impact of Katrina only among a community that was hit by the hurricane and not seek out a comparison group from a community that did not experience the hurricane. Researchers using this design must be extremely cautious about making claims regarding the effect of the stimulus, though the design could be useful for exploratory studies aimed at testing one's measures or the feasibility of further study. Finally, if a researcher is unlikely to be able to identify a sample large enough to split into multiple groups, or if he or she simply doesn't have access to a control group, the researcher might use a one-group pre-post-test design. In this instance, pre- and post-tests are both taken, but, as stated, there is no control group to which to compare the experimental group. We might be able to study of the impact of Hurricane Katrina using this design if we begin collecting data on the impacted communities prior to the hurricane. We could then collect similar data after the hurricane. Applying this design involves a bit of serendipity and chance. Without having collected data from impacted communities prior to the hurricane, we would be unable to employ a one-group pre-post-test design to study Hurricane Katrina's impact. Table 12.3 summarizes each of the preceding examples of pre-experimental designs. Pretest stimulus, experimental group, control group, one-shot case study, XXX, static group, comparison, XX, one group, pre-post-test, XXX. Table 12.3 Pre-experimental designs. As implied by the preceding examples where we considered studying the impact of Hurricane Katrina, experiments do not necessarily need to take place in the controlled setting of a lab. In fact, many applied researchers rely on experiments to assess the Chapter 12 impact and effectiveness of various programs and policies. You might recall our discussion of the police experiment described in Linking Methods with Theory, page 17. It is an excellent example of an applied experiment. Researchers did not subject participants to conditions in a lab setting. Instead, they applied their stimulus, in this case, arrest, to some subjects in the field, and they also had a control group in the field that did not receive the stimulus, and therefore were not arrested. Finally, a review of some of the strengths and weaknesses of experiments as a method of data collection is in order. A strength of this method, particularly in cases where experiments are conducted in lab settings, is that the researcher has substantial control over the conditions to which participants are subjected. Experiments are also generally easier to replicate than are other methods of data collection. Again, this is particularly true in cases where an experiment has been conducted in a lab setting. As sociologists, who are especially attentive to how social context shapes social life, are likely to point out, a disadvantage of experiments is that they are rather artificial. How often do real-world social interactions occur in the same way that they do in a lab? Experiments that are conducted in applied settings may not be as subject to artificiality, though then their conditions are less easily controlled. Experiments also present a few unique concerns regarding validity. Problems of external validity might arise when the conditions of an experiment don't adequately represent those of the world outside the boundaries of the experiment. In the case of McCoy and Major S. 2003-14 research on prejudice described earlier in this section, for example, the questions to ask with regard to external validity are these: can we say with certainty that the stimulus applied to the experimental group resembles the stimuli that people are likely to encounter in their real lives outside of the lab? Will reading an article on prejudice against one's race in a lab have the same impact that it would outside of the lab? This is not to suggest that experimental research is not or cannot be valid, but experimental researchers must always be aware that external validity problems can occur and be forthcoming in their reports of findings about this potential weakness. Concerns about internal validity also arise in experimental designs. These have to do with our level of confidence about whether the stimulus actually produced the observed effect or whether some other factor, such as other conditions of the experiment or changes in participants over time, may have produced the effect. In sum, the potential strengths and weaknesses of experiments as a method of data collection in social scientific research include the following: strengths, weaknesses, researcher, control, artificiality. Table 12.4 Strengths and weaknesses of experimental research. 14. McCoy, S.K., and Major, B. 2003. Group identification moderates emotional response to perceived prejudice. Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, 29, 1005-1017. 229. Reliability. unique concerns about internal and external validity. Table 12.4 Strengths and weaknesses of experimental research. Key takeaways. Experiments are designed to test hypotheses under controlled conditions. True experimental designs differ from pre-experimental designs. Pre-experimental designs each lack one of the core features of true experimental designs. Experiments enable researchers to have great control over the conditions to which participants are subjected and are typically easier to replicate than other methods of data collection. Experiments come with some degree of artificiality and may run into problems of external or internal validity. Exercises. E. Taking into consideration your own research topic of interest, how might you conduct an experiment to learn more about your topic? Which experiment type would you use, and why? Do you agree or disagree with the sociological critique that experiments are artificial? Why or why not? How important is this weakness? Do the strengths of experimental research outweigh this drawback? 3. Be a research participant. The Social Psychology Network offers many online opportunities to participate in social psychological experiments. Check them out at http://www.socialpsychology.org/exps.htm。12年1月3日 Ethnomethodology and Conversation Analysis. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http://Creative Commons org/licenses by NC-SA 4.0 Learning Objectives. E. Define ethnomethodology and describe its purpose. Define and describe conversation analysis. Chapter 12 230. Though not unique methods of data collection per se, ethnomethodology and conversation analysis are unique enough and prominent enough in sociology that they warrant some dedicated attention in this text. Ethnomethodology refers to the study of everyday reality. Rather than assume that the purpose of social science is to understand some objective reality, ethnomethodologists investigate how people construct, prolong, and maintain their realities. The term ethnomethodology was coined by sociologist Harold Garfinkel, 1967, who, as described in his 2011 obituary, was a sociologist who delved into the minutiae of everyday life. Lynch, 2011. 16. Ethnomethodology's emphasis on the everyday and on ordinary people as methods for producing order in their social worlds is perhaps its most distinctive characteristic. An example of ethnomethodological research is C.M. Scharf's 2008 17 study of how young feminist women do social class. In her study, Scharf examines data from interviews with 40 German and British young women to understand how they think, talk, and feel about feminism. p. 334. By focusing in on language, talk, and interaction, Scharf argues that her account is ethnomethodological in nature. Kevin Whitehead, 2009 18 also takes an ethnomethodological approach in his study of the social organization of race. In Whitehead's words, he considers one mechanism by which racial categories, racial common sense, and thus the social organization of race itself are reproduced in interaction, p. 325. 19. To study these processes, Whitehead analyzed the interactions and practices of participants in an employment race training workshop and found that individuals use race as a framework from which to understand their own and others' actions, thereby reproducing race as a relevant social category. Conversation analysis grew out of ethnomethodology, Schutt, 2006, 20, and thus shares its focus on the construction of reality as opposed to the discovery of reality. Conversation analysts focus specifically on talk in interaction, how talk progresses, how it is facilitated or impeded, how turns are taken in talk, and how these processes both shape and are shaped by social context. In conversation analysis, what people say is just as important as how they say it. Also important are the pauses people take in expressing themselves and how or whether they interrupt themselves or others while talking. Conversation analysts might study recordings of court proceedings or legislative debates to learn about the social construction of law and punishment. They might also study more simple interactions, such as a conversation between two people meeting for coffee. Some research methods texts include coverage of ethnomethodology and conversation analysis in their presentations of qualitative data analysis, Schutt, 2006. 21. It makes sense to do so. Both represent unique approaches to analyzing qualitative data. Yet they also rest upon particular ontological and epistemological assumptions. 15. Garfinkel, H. 1967. Studies in Ethnomethodology. Englewood Cliffs, N.J., Prentice Hall. 16. Lynch, M. 2011, July 13. Harold Garfinkel Obituary. The Guardian. Retrieved from http://www.guardian.co.uk/education/2011-13 Harold Garfinkel Obituary. 17. Scharf, C.M. 2008. Doing Class, A Discursive and Ethnomethodological Approach. Critical Discourse Studies, 5, 331-343. 18. Whitehead, K. 2009. Categorizing the Categorizer, The Management of Racial Common Sense in Interaction. Social Psychology Quarterly, 72, 325-342. 19. Whitehead, K. 2009. Categorizing the Categorizer, The Management of Racial Common Sense in Interaction. Social Psychology Quarterly, 72, 325-342. 20. Schutt, R.K. 2006. Investigating the Social World, The Process and Practice of Research, 5th ed. Thousand Oaks, C.A., Sage. 21. Schutt, R.K. 2006. Investigating the Social World, The Process and Practice of Research, 5th ed. Thousand Oaks, C.A., Sage. 231. That set them apart, in some ways at least, from more traditional mechanisms of analysis such as coding. Key takeaways. Ethnomethodologists study everyday reality and how people produce those realities through their presentations of self and interactions with others. Conversation analysts focus specifically on the dynamics of talk. Exercise. E. Professor Niraj Murthy requires his introduction to sociology students to conduct an ethnomethodology exercise to help them understand the sociological and very social aspects of everyday activities. To understand how these activities are social, Murthy asks students to engage in some activity that interrupts the natural facts of life, Garfinkel as words. Read about their experiences here. http://learn.bowden.edu/soc101p:/68. What do these students' reports tell us about how everyday activities are also social activities? Chapter 12 232 Chapter 13 Sharing Your Work 13.1 Research as Public Activity. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http://Creative Commons org licenses by NC-SA 4.0 In Introduction, page 3, you were introduced to the recent trend toward public sociology. As you might recall, public sociology refers to the application of sociological theories and research to matters of public interest. You might also recall that sociologists differ in their feelings about whether and the extent to which sociologists should aspire to conduct public sociology, whether they support the movement toward public sociology or not. Most sociologists who conduct research hope that their work will have relevance to others besides themselves. As such, research is in some ways a public activity. While the work may be conducted by an individual in a private setting, the knowledge gained from that work should be shared with one's peers and other parties who may have an interest. Understanding how to share one's work is an important aspect of the research process. 13年1月1日 Deciding what to share and with whom to share it. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC-SA 4.0 Learning Objectives. E. Identify the 6 questions social researchers should be able to answer to ensure that their ethical obligations have been met. Describe how differences in one's audience might shape how a person shares research findings. When preparing to share our work with others, we must decide what to share, with whom to share it, and in what format to share it. In this section, we'll consider the former 2 aspects of sharing our work. In the sections that follow, we'll consider the various formats and mechanisms through which social scientists might share their work. 13年1月1日 Sharing it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC-SA 4.0 Because conducting sociological research is a scholarly pursuit and because sociological researchers generally aim to reach a true understanding of social processes, it is crucial that we share all aspects of our research, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Doing so helps ensure that others will understand, be able to build from 233 and effectively critique our work. We considered this aspect of the research process in Research Ethics, page 33, but it is worth reviewing here. In Research Ethics, page 33, we learned about the importance of sharing all aspects of our work for ethical reasons and for the purpose of replication. In preparing to share your work with others, and in order to meet your ethical obligations as a sociological researcher, challenge yourself to answer the following questions. 1. Why did I conduct this research? 2. How did I conduct this research? 3. For whom did I conduct this research? 4. What conclusions can I reasonably draw from this research? 5. Knowing what I know now, what would I do differently? 6. How could this research be improved? Understanding why you conducted your research will help you be honest with yourself and your readers about your own personal interest, investments, or biases with respect to the work. In beginning a research project, page 50, I suggested that starting where you are is a good way to begin a research project. While this is true, using the idea of starting where you are effectively requires that you be honest with yourself and your readers about where you are and why you have chosen to conduct research in a particular area. Being able to clearly communicate how you conducted your research is also important. This means being honest about your data collection methods, sample and sampling strategy, and analytic strategy. The third question in the list is designed to help you articulate who the major stakeholders are in your research. Of course, the researcher is a stakeholder. Additional stakeholders might include funders, research participants, or others who share something in common with your research subjects, e.g., members of some community where you conducted research or members of the same social group, such as parents or athletes, upon whom you conducted your research. Professors for whom you conducted research as part of a class project might be stakeholders, as might employers for whom you conducted research. We'll revisit the concept of stakeholders in research methods in the real world, page 255. The fourth question should help you think about the major strengths of your work. Finally, the last two questions are designed to make you think about potential weaknesses in your work and how future research might build from or improve upon your work.
13年1月1日2 Knowing your audience.
Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http://. Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Once you are able to articulate what to share, you must decide with whom to share it. Certainly the most obvious candidates with whom you'll share your work are other social scientists. If you are conducting research for a class project, your main audience will probably be your professor. Perhaps you'll also share your work with other students in the class. Other potential audiences include stakeholders, reporters. Chapter 13 234. And other media representatives, policymakers, and members of the public more generally. While you would never alter your actual findings for different audiences, understanding who your audience is will help you frame your research in a way that is most meaningful to that audience. For example, I have shared findings from my study of older worker harassment with a variety of audiences, including students in my classes, colleagues in my own discipline, Blackstone, 2010 and outside of it. Blackstone, forthcoming, News Reporters, Leary, 2010 3 The organization that funded my research, Blackstone, 2008 4 Older workers themselves, and government. 2010 5 and other agencies that deal with workplace policy and worker advocacy. I shared with all these audiences what I view as the study's three major findings, that devaluing older workers' contributions by ignoring them or excluding them from important decisions is the most common harassment experience for people in my sample, that there were few differences between women's and men's experiences and their perceptions of workplace harassment, and that the most common way older workers respond when harassed is to keep it to themselves and tell no one. But how I presented these findings and the level of detail I shared about how I reached these findings varied by audience. I shared the most detail about my research methodology, including data collection method, sampling, and analytic strategy, with colleagues and with my funding agency. In addition, the funding agency requested and received information about the exact timeline during which I collected data and any minor bureaucratic hiccups I encountered during the course of collecting data. These hiccups had no bearing on the data actually collected or relevance to my findings, but they were nevertheless details to which I felt my funder should be privy. I shared similar information with my student audience, though I attempted to use less technical jargon with students than I used with colleagues. Now that you've considered what to share and with whom to share it, let us consider how social scientists share their research. Key takeaways. As they prepare to share their research, researchers must keep in mind their ethical obligations to their peers, their research participants, and the public. Audience peculiarities will shape how much and in what ways details about one's research are reported. Blackstone, A. 2010, August. The young girls thought I should be home waiting to die. Harassment of older workers. Presentation at the annual meeting of the American Sociological Association, Atlanta, GA. Blackstone, A. Forthcoming. Harassment of older adults in the workplace. In P. Brownell and J. Kelly, eds, Ageism in the Workplace. London, UK, Springer, Verlag. 3. Leary, M. 2010, August. Interview by MAN Public Broadcasting Network, MAN State Capitol News Service. 4. Blackstone, A. 2008. Workplace Harassment, Conceptualizations of Older Workers, National Science Foundation Grant. SES-08-176773. 5. Blackstone, A. 2010, June. Workplace Harassment, Conceptualizations and Experiences of Older Workers in Men. Presentation to the Men Jobs Council, Augusta, Amy. 235. Exercise. E. Read a scholarly article of your choice. What evidence can you find that might indicate that the author gave some thought to the 6 questions outlined in this section?
13年1月2日
Presenting your research. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http://. Creative Commons org/ licenses/ by NC, SA/ 4.0/ Learning Objectives. E. Identify the major principles of formal presentations of research. 2. Describe roundtable presentations and their benefits. 3. Discuss the purpose of and formatting principles for poster presentations. Presenting your research is an excellent way to get feedback on your work. Professional sociologists often make presentations to their peers to prepare for more formally writing up and eventually publishing their work. Presentations might be formal talks, either as part of a panel at a professional conference or to some other group of peers or other interested parties, less formal roundtable discussions. Another common professional conference format, or posters that are displayed in some specially designated area. We'll look at all three presentation formats here. When preparing a formal talk, it is very important to get details well in advance about how long your presentation is expected to last and whether any visual aids such as video or PowerPoint slides are expected by your audience. At conferences, the typical formal talk is usually expected to last between 15 and 20 minutes. While this may sound like a torturously lengthy amount of time, you'll be amazed the first time you present formally by how easily time can fly. Once a researcher gets into the groove of talking about something as near and dear to him as his very own research, it is common for him to become so engrossed in it and enamored of the sound of his own voice that he forgets to watch the clock and finds himself being dragged off stage after giving only an introduction of his research method. To avoid this all too common occurrence, it is crucial that you repeatedly practice your presentation in advance and time yourself. One stumbling block in formal presentations of research work is setting up the study or problem the research addresses. Keep in mind that with limited time, audience members will be more interested to hear about your original work than to hear you cite a long list of previous studies to introduce your own research. While in scholarly written reports of your work, you must discuss the studies that have come before yours. In a presentation of your work, the key is to use what precious time you have to highlight your work. Whatever you do in your formal presentation, do not read your paper verbatim. Nothing will bore an audience more quickly than that. Highlight only. Chapter 13 The key points of your study. These generally include your research question, your methodological approach, your major findings, and a few final takeaways. In less formal roundtable presentations of your work, the aim is usually to help stimulate a conversation about a topic. The time you are given to present may be slightly shorter than in a formal presentation, and you'll also be expected to participate in the conversation that follows all presenters' talks. Roundtables can be especially useful when your research is in the earlier stages of development. Perhaps you've conducted a pilot study and you'd like to talk through some of your findings and get some ideas about where to take the study next. A roundtable is an excellent place to get some suggestions and also get a preview of the objections reviewers may raise with respect to your conclusions or your approach to the work. Roundtables are also great places to network and meet other scholars who share a common interest with you. Finally, in a poster presentation, you visually represent your work, just as you Wouldn't you read a paper verbatim in a formal presentation? Avoid at all costs printing and pasting your paper onto a poster board. Instead, think about how to tell the story of your work in graphs, charts, tables, and other images. Bulleted points are also fine, as long as the poster isn't so wordy that it would be difficult for someone walking by very slowly to grasp your major argument and findings. Posters, like round tables, can be quite helpful at the early stages of a research project because they are designed to encourage the audience to engage you in conversation about your research. Don't feel that you must share every detail of your work in a poster. The point is to share highlights and then converse with your audience to get their feedback, hear their questions, and provide additional details about your research. Key takeaways. Informal presentations include your research question, methodological approach, major findings, and a few final takeaways. Roundtable presentations emphasize discussion among participants. Poster presentations are visual representations of research findings. Exercises. E. Imagine how you might present some of your work in poster format. What would the poster look like? What would it contain? Many helpful web resources offer advice on how to create a scholarly poster presentation. Simply Google scholarly poster presentation and you'll find hundreds of sites that share tips on creating an effective poster. Visit a few of the links that your Google search yielded. How has your vision for your poster changed and why?
237.
2. One way to prepare yourself for presenting your work in any format is to get comfortable talking casually with others about your research. Practice with your friends and family. Engage them in a conversation about your research. Or if you haven't conducted research yet, talk about your research interests. Ask them to repeat what they heard you express about your research project or interest. How closely do their reports match what you intended to express?
13年1月3日
Writing up research results. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http://. Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Learning Objectives. E. Identify the differences between reports for scholarly consumption and reports for public consumption. Define plagiarism and explain why it should be taken seriously. I once had a student who conducted research on how children interact with each other in public. She was inspired to conduct her work after reading Barry Thorne's
1993
research on how children regulate gender through their interactions with one another. This student conducted field observations of children on playgrounds for an assignment in my research methods class. The assignment included writing up a scholarly report of findings. After writing up her scholarly report, the student revised it and submitted it for publication in the student column of Contexts, the American Sociological Association's public interest magazine, Yearwood, 2009. 7. Because Contexts readers run the gamut from academic sociologists to non-academics and non-sociologists who simply have an interest in the magazine's content. Articles in the magazines are presented in a different format from the format used in other sociology journals. Thus, my student had the opportunity to write up her findings in two different ways, first for scholarly consumption and then for public consumption. As she learned, and as we will discuss in this section, reports for fellow scholars typically differ from reports for a more general public audience. Reports of findings that will be read by other scholars generally follow the format outlined in the discussion of reviewing the literature in research design, page 72. As you may recall from that chapter, most scholarly reports of research include an abstract, an introduction, a literature review, a discussion of research methodology, a presentation of findings, and some concluding remarks and discussion about implications of the work. Reports written for scholarly consumption also contain a list of references, and many include tables or charts that visually represent some component of the findings. Reading prior literature in your area of interest is an excellent way to develop an understanding of the core components of scholarly research reports and to begin to learn how to write those components yourself. There. 6. Thorne, B. 1993. Gender Play, Girls and Boys in School. New Brunswick, N.J., Rutgers University Press. 7. Yearwood, E. 2009. Children and Gender. Contexts. 8. Chapter 13 238. Also are many excellent resources to help guide students as they prepare to write scholarly reports of research. Johnson, Rittig, Scott, and Garrison, 2009, Sociology. Writing Group, 2007, Becker, 2007, American Sociological Association, 2010. 8. Reports written for public consumption differ from those written for scholarly consumption. As noted elsewhere in this chapter, knowing your audience is crucial when preparing a report of your research. What are they likely to want to hear about? What portions of the research do you feel are crucial to share, regardless of the audience? Answering these questions will help you determine how to shape any written reports you plan to produce. In fact, some outlets answer these questions for you, as in the case of newspaper editorials where rules of style, presentation, and length will dictate the shape of your written report. Whoever your audience, don't forget what it is that you are reporting. Social scientific evidence. Take seriously your role as a social scientist and your place among peers in your discipline. Present your findings as clearly and as honestly as you possibly can. Pay appropriate homage to the scholars who have come before you, even while you raise questions about their work, and aim to engage your readers in a discussion about your work and about avenues for further inquiry. Even if you won't ever meet your readers face to face, imagine what they might ask you upon reading your report. Imagine your response, and provide some of those details in your written report. Finally, take extraordinary care not to commit plagiarism. Presenting someone else's words or ideas as if they are your own is among the most egregious transgressions a scholar can commit. Indeed, plagiarism has ended many careers. Maffley, 2011, and many students' opportunities to pursue degrees. Go, 2008. Should take this very, very seriously. If you feel a little afraid and paranoid after reading this warning, consider it a good thing, and let it motivate you to take extra care to ensure that you are not plagiarizing the work of others. Key takeaways. Reports for public consumption usually contain fewer details than reports for scholarly consumption. Keep your role and obligations as a social scientist in mind as you write up research reports. Plagiarism is among the most egregious transgressions a scholar can commit. 8. Johnson, W.A., Riddick, R.P., Scott, G.M., and Garrison, S.M. 2009. The Sociology Student Writer's Manual, 6th ed. Upper Saddle River, N.J., Prentice Hall, Sociology Writing Group. 2007. A Guide to Writing Sociology Papers. New York, N.Y., Worth. Becker, H.S. 2007. Writing for Social Scientists, How to Start and Finish Your Thesis, Book, or Article, R&D ed. Chicago, IL. University of Chicago Press, American Sociological Association. 2010. ASA Style Guide, 4th ed. Washington, D.C., author. A very brief version of the ASA Style Guide can be found at http://www.asanet.org/students/ASA20 quick20 style20 20 Guide 2004th 20 edition 20 update PDF 9. As just a single example, take note of this story. Mathley, B. 2011, August 19. Pattern of plagiarism costs University of Utah scholar his job. The Salt Lake Tribune. Retrieved from http://slowdrip.com/cougars/523783777/bacteria University Panel Plagiarism.html.csp page 1 10. As a single example of many of the consequences for students of committing plagiarism, see Go A. 2008. 2. Students kicked off semester at sea for plagiarism. U.S. News and World Report. Retrieved from http://www.usnews.com/ Education-blog-paper, trail-2008-08-14-2, students, kicked off, semester, at sea, for, plagiarism. 239. Exercises. 1. Imagine that you've been tasked with sharing the results of some of your research with your parents. What details would you be sure to include? What details might you leave out, and why? Have a discussion with a few of your peers about plagiarism. How do you each define the term? What strategies do you employ to ensure that you avoid committing plagiarism? 13年1月4日 Disseminating findings. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org/licenses/ by NC/SA/ 4.0/ Learning Objectives. 1. Define dissemination. Discuss the 3 considerations to keep in mind in order to successfully disseminate your findings. Presenting your work, discussed in Presenting Your Research, page 236, is one way of disseminating your research findings. In this section, we'll focus on disseminating the written results of your research. Dissemination refers to a planned process that involves consideration of target audiences and the settings in which research findings are to be received and, where appropriate, communicating and interacting with wider policy and service audiences in ways that will facilitate research uptake in decision-making processes and practice. Wilson, Pettigrew, Calnan, and Nateris, 2010, p. 91. 11. In other words, dissemination of research findings involves careful planning, thought, consideration of target audiences, and communication with those audiences. Writing up results from your research and having others take notice are two entirely different propositions. In fact, the general rule of thumb is that people will not take notice unless you help and encourage them to do so. To paraphrase the classic line from the film Field of Dreams, just because you build it doesn't mean they will come. Disseminating your findings successfully requires determining who your audience is, where your audience is, and how to reach them. When considering who your audience is, think about who is likely to take interest in your work. Your audience might include those who do not express enthusiastic interest but might nevertheless benefit from an awareness of your research. Your research participants and those who share some characteristics in common with your participants are likely to have some interest in what you've discovered in the course of your research. Other scholars who study similar topics are another obvious audience for your work. Perhaps there are policymakers who should take note of your work. Organizations that do work in an area related to the topic of your research are another possibility. Finally, any and all. 11. Wilson, P.M., Pettigrew, M., Calnan, M.W., and Nateris, I. 2010. Disseminating research findings. What should researchers do? A systematic scoping review of conceptual frameworks. Implementation Science, 5, 91. Chapter 13 240. Inquisitive and engaged members of the public represent a possible audience for your work. Where your audience is should be fairly obvious once you've determined who you'd like your audience to be. You know where your research participants are because you've studied them. You can find interested scholars on your campus, e.g., perhaps you could offer to present your findings at some campus event, at professional conferences, and via publications such as professional organizations' newsletters, an often overlooked source for sharing findings in brief form, and scholarly journals. Policymakers include your state and federal representatives who, at least in theory, should be available to hear a constituent speak on matters of policy interest. Perhaps you're already aware of organizations that do work in an area related to your research topic, but if not, a simple web search should help you identify possible organizational audiences for your work. Disseminating your findings to the public more generally could take any number of forms: a letter to the editor of the local newspaper, a blog, or even a post or two on your Facebook wall. Finally, determining how to reach your audiences will vary according to which audience you wish to reach. Your strategy should be determined by the norms of the audience. For example, scholarly journals provide author submission instructions that clearly define requirements for anyone wishing to disseminate their work via a particular journal. The same is true for newspaper editorials. Check your newspaper's website for details about how to format and submit letters to the editor. If you wish to reach out to your political representatives, a call to their offices or, again, a simple web search should tell you how to do that. Whether you act on all these suggestions is ultimately your decision. But if you've conducted high-quality research and you have findings that are likely to be of interest to any constituents besides yourself, I would argue that it is your duty as a scholar and a sociologist to share those findings. In sum, disseminating findings involves the following 3 steps. 1. Determine who your audience is. 2. Identify where your audience is. 3. Discover how best to reach them. Key takeaways. Disseminating findings takes planning and careful consideration of one's audiences. The dissemination process includes determining the who, where, and how of reaching one's audiences. Exercises. 1. What additional potential audiences for your research, aside from those already mentioned, can you identify? How might you reach those audiences?
241.
2. Do you agree or disagree with the assertion that researchers who conduct high-quality research have a duty to share their findings with others? Explain. Chapter
13 242.
Chapter 14 Reading and Understanding Social Research.
14.1
Sociology in Everyday Life. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 You might think that sociological research plays a very small role in our day-to-day lives, but once you know what to look for, you will soon discover that it is more a part of our everyday lives than you might have imagined. This is even truer now that you have taken a class in sociological research methods. Having some background in an understanding of the scientific method means that you are now better equipped to understand, question, and critique all kinds of scientific research, as many of the basic tenets of good research are similar across disciplines that employ the scientific method. Those tenets include having a well-designed and carefully planned study, having some theoretical grounding and understanding of research that has come before one's own work, and engaging in peer review, to name just a few. In this chapter, we'll consider how to responsibly read research findings and examine areas of everyday life where sociological research may be present, even if it is not immediately visible. As you read this chapter and research methods in the real world, page 255, you may recall several of the topics and points made in other chapters of this text. The aim in these final chapters is to remind you of the relevance of sociological research and why one might care to know something about it. These chapters are also designed to encourage you to think critically about how sociology does and can shape your everyday life, both in ways you might choose and in ways you might not be aware of.
14年1月1日
Reading Reports of Sociological Research. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Learning Objectives. 1. Identify what one can learn from an article simply by reading its abstract and its acknowledgments. 2. Describe how tables presenting causal relationships are typically presented. 3. Identify several key questions to ask when reading research reports. By now you should have a good idea about the basic components of sociological research projects. You know how sociological research is designed, and you are familiar with how to frame a review of sociological literature. In research design.
243.
Page 72, we discussed the various components of a research project and presented some tips on how to review literature as you design your own research project. But I hope that you'll find the sociological literature to be of interest and relevance to you, beyond figuring out how to summarize and critique it in relation to your research plans. We sociologists like to think the research we do matters, but it cannot matter if our research reports go unread or are not understandable. In this section we'll review some material from research design, page 72, regarding sociological literature, and we'll consider some additional tips for how to read and understand reports of sociological research. As mentioned in research design, page 72, reading the abstract that appears in most reports of scholarly research will provide you with an excellent, easily digestible review of a study's major findings and of the framework the author is using to position her findings. Abstracts typically contain just a few hundred words, so reading them is a nice way to quickly familiarize yourself with a study. Another thing to look for as you set out to read and comprehend a research report is the author's acknowledgments. Who supported the work by providing feedback or other assistance? If relevant, are you familiar with the research of those who provided feedback on the report you are about to read? Are any organizations mentioned as having supported the research in some way, either through funding or by providing other resources to the researcher? Familiarizing yourself with an author's acknowledgments will give you additional contextual information within which to frame and understand what you are about to read. Once you have read the abstract and acknowledgments, you could next peruse the discussion section near the end of the report, as suggested in research design, page 72. You might also take a look at any tables that are included in the article. A table provides a quick, condensed summary of the report's key findings. The use of tables is not limited to one form or type of data, though they are used most commonly in quantitative research. Tables are a concise way to report large amounts of data. Some tables present descriptive information about a researcher's sample. These tables will likely contain frequencies, and percentages, 百分之. For example, if gender happened to be an important variable for the researcher's analysis, a descriptive table would show how many and what % of all study participants are women and how many 斜线, what % are men. Frequencies, or how many, will probably be listed as n, while the % symbol, 百分之, might be used to indicate percentages. In a table presenting a causal relationship, independent variable attributes are typically presented in the table as columns, while dependent variable attributes are presented in rows. This allows the reader to scan across a table as rows to see how values on the dependent variable attributes change as the independent variable attribute values change. Tables displaying results of quantitative analysis will also likely include some information about the strength and statistical significance of the relationships presented in the table. These details tell the reader how likely it is that the relationships presented will have occurred simply by chance. Let us look at a specific example. Table 14.1, based on data from my study of older workers, presents the causal relationship between gender and experiencing harassing behaviors at work. In this example, gender is the independent variable and the Chapter 14 harassing behaviors listed are the dependent variables. I have therefore placed gender in the table as columns and harassing behaviors in the table as rows. Reading across the table as top row, we see that 2.9% of women in the sample reported experiencing subtle or obvious threats to their safety at work, while 4.7% of men in the sample reported the same. We can read across each of the rows of the table in this way. Reading across the bottom row, we see that 9.4% of women in the sample reported experiencing stalking or invasion of their personal space at work, while just 2.3% of men in the sample reported having the same experience. Of course, we cannot assume that these patterns didn't simply occur by chance. How confident can we be that the findings presented in the table did not occur by chance? This is where tests of statistical significance come in handy. Statistical significance tells us the likelihood that the relationships we observe could be caused by something other than chance. While your statistics class will give you more specific details on tests of statistical significance and reading quantitative tables, the important thing to be aware of as a non-expert reader of tables is that some of the relationships presented will be statistically significant and others may not be. Tables should provide information about the statistical significance of the relationships presented. When reading a researcher's conclusions, be sure to pay attention to which relationships are statistically significant and which are not. In Table 14.1, you'll see that a p-value is noted in the very last column of the table. A p-value is a statistical measure of the probability that there is no relationship between the variables under study. Another way of putting this is that the p-value provides guidance on whether or not we should reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is simply the assumption that no relationship exists between the variables in question. In Table 14.1, we see that for the first behavior listed, the p-value is 0.623. This means that there is a 62.3% chance that the null hypothesis is correct in this case. In other words, it seems likely that any relationship between observed gender and experiencing threats to safety at work in this sample is simply due to chance. In the final row of the table, however, we see that the p-value is 0.039. In other words, there is a 3.9% chance that the null hypothesis is correct. Thus we can be somewhat more confident than in the preceding example that there may be some relationship between a person's gender and his experiencing the behavior noted in this row. We might say that this finding is significant at the 0.5 level. This means that the probability that the relationship between gender and experiencing stirring or invasion of personal space at work is due to sampling error alone is less than 5 英寸100. Notice that I am hedging my bets here by using words like somewhat and maybe. When testing hypotheses, social scientists generally couch their findings in terms of rejecting the null hypothesis rather than making bold statements about the relationships observed in their tables. You can learn more about creating tables, reading tables, and tests of statistical significance in a class focused exclusively on statistical analysis. For now, I hope this brief introduction to reading tables will give you more confidence in your ability to read and understand the quantitative tables you encounter while reading reports of sociological research. It wouldn't make any sense to say that people's workplace experiences cause their gender, so in this example, the question of which is the independent variable and which are the dependent variables has a pretty obvious answer.
245.
Behavior experienced at work women men. P. Value. Subtle or obvious threats to your safety.
2.9%, 4.70.623.
Being hit, pushed, or grabbed.
2.2%, 4.70.480.
Comments or behaviors that demean your gender.
6.5%, 2.30.184.
Comments or behaviors that demean your age.
13.8%, 9.30.407.
Stirring or invasion of your personal space.
9.4%, 2.30.039.
Note, sample size was 138 for women and 43 for men. Table 14.1% reporting harassing behaviors at work. Having read the tables in a research report, along with the abstract, acknowledgements, and discussion in the report, you are finally ready to read the report in its entirety. As you read a research report, there are several questions you can ask yourself about each section, from abstract to conclusion. Those questions are summarized in Table 14.2. Keep in mind that the questions covered here are designed to help you, the reader, to think critically about the research you come across and to get a general understanding of the strengths, weaknesses, and key takeaways from a given study. I hope that by considering how you might respond to the following questions while reading research reports, you'll feel confident that you could describe the report to others and discuss its meaning and impact with them. Report section questions worth asking. Abstract. What are the key findings? How were those findings reached? What framework does the researcher employ? Acknowledgements. Who are this study's major stakeholders? Who provided feedback? Who provided? Table 14.2 questions worth asking while reading research reports. Chapter 14 246. Support in the form of funding or other resources. Introduction. How does the author frame his or her research focus? What other possible ways of framing the problem exist? Why might the author have chosen this particular way of framing the problem? Literature review. How selective does the researcher appear to have been in identifying relevant literature? To discuss Does the review of literature appear appropriately extensive? Does the researcher provide a critical review? Sample. Was probability sampling or non-probability sampling employed? What is the researcher's sample? What is the researcher's population? What claims will the researcher be able to make based on the sample? What are the sample's major strengths and major weaknesses? Data collection. How were the data collected? What do you know about the relative strengths and weaknesses of the method employed? What other methods of data collection might have been employed, and why was this particular method employed? What do you know about the data collection strategy and instruments? E.g., questions asked, locations observed. What don't you know about the data collection strategy and instruments? Data analysis. How were the data analyzed? Is there enough information provided that you feel confident that the proper analytic procedures were employed accurately? Results. What are the study's major findings? Are findings linked back to previously described research questions, objectives, hypotheses, and literature? Are sufficient amounts of data, e.g., quotes and observations in Table 14.2 questions worth asking while reading research reports?
247.
Qualitative work, statistics in quantitative work, provided in order to support conclusions drawn. Are tables readable? Discussion
斜线
Conclusion. Does the author generalize to some population beyond her or his sample? How are these claims presented? Are claims made supported by data provided in the results section, e.g., supporting quotes, statistical significance? Have limitations of the study been fully disclosed and adequately addressed? Are implications sufficiently explored? Table 14.2 questions worth asking while reading research reports. Key takeaways. In tables presenting causal relationships, the independent variable is typically presented in the table as columns while the dependent variables are presented in the table as rows. When reading a research report, there are several key questions you should ask yourself for each section of the report. Exercises. E. Find a table in a research report of your choosing. Challenge yourself to summarize the relationships represented by the table. Check your work by reading the findings section of the article. Read a scholarly article from start to finish, answering the questions outlined in Table 14.2 as you read through each section.
14年1月2日
Being a responsible consumer of research. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA /4.0 Learning Objective. E. Identify what one needs to do to be a responsible consumer of research. Being a responsible consumer of research requires that you take seriously your identity as a social scientist. Now that you are familiar with how to conduct research and how to read the results of others' research, you have some responsibility to put Chapter 14 248 your knowledge and skills to use. Doing so is in part a matter of being able to distinguish what you do know based on the information provided by research findings from what you do not know. It is also a matter of having some awareness about what you can and cannot reasonably know as you encounter research findings. When assessing social scientific findings, think about what information has been provided to you. In a scholarly journal article, you will presumably be given a great deal of information about the researcher's method of data collection, her or his sample, and information about how the researcher identified and recruited research participants. All these details provide important contextual information that can help you assess the researcher's claims. If, on the other hand, you come across some discussion of social scientific research in a popular magazine or newspaper, chances are that you will not find the same level of detailed information that you would find in a scholarly journal article. In this case, what you do and do not know is more limited than in the case of a scholarly journal article. Also take into account whatever information is provided about a study's funding source. Most funders want, and in fact require, that recipients acknowledge them in publications. But more popular press may leave out a funding source. In this internet age, it can be relatively easy to obtain information about how a study was funded. If this information is not provided in the source from which you learned about a study, it might behoove you to do a quick search on the web to see if you can learn more about a researcher's funding findings that seem to support a particular political agenda, for example, might have more or less weight once you know whether and by whom a study was funded. There is some information that even the most responsible consumer of research cannot know. Because researchers are ethically bound to protect the identities of their subjects, for example, we will never know exactly who participated in a given study. Researchers may also choose not to reveal any personal stakes they hold in the research they conduct. While researchers may start where they are, a process outlined in beginning a research project, page 50, we cannot know for certain whether or how researchers are personally connected to their work unless they choose to share such details. Neither of these unknowables is necessarily problematic, but having some awareness of what you may never know about a study does provide important contextual information from which to assess what one can take away from a given report of findings. Key takeaway: being a responsible consumer of research means giving serious thought to and understanding what you do know, what you don't know, what you can know, and what you can't know. Exercise 1. Find a report of scholarly research in a newspaper. What do you know from the report? What don't you know? How might you find the answers to your remaining questions?
249 14年1月3日
Media reports of sociological research. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-like
4.0 International License, http://.
Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Learning objectives 1. Cite the major differences between scholarly and media reports of sociological research. 2. Identify the kinds of questions that may remain unanswered in media. Reports of sociological research. As you have probably already gathered, we are likely to encounter sociological research in the news and other media. For example, check out the American Sociological Association's media coverage links, http://www.asnet.org/press/media coverage-highlights.cfn. There you'll see that for just one study on the consequences of parental divorce for child development, Kim, 2011, there were 170 news articles describing the study and its findings over the course of 1 month, June 2011. This particular study provides a good example of the difference between the information provided about a study in a scholarly journal article and the media's coverage of the same study. Let us look at some of the differences between the aforementioned study's coverage in the media and its treatment in a scholarly journal. First, watch the following coverage. From the View's August 24, 2011 program, http://view.abc.go.com/video-hot-topics. Affects divorce kids. Once you have watched the clip, ask yourself what you have learned about the study. Who conducted the research described? What are the study's key findings? How many people participated in the study? Who were those participants? What sorts of data were analyzed? Which findings were statistically significant? Also note what questions you still have about the study. Where might you go to get the answers to your questions? After watching the View clip several times, I was able to gather that the study has two key findings. A child is more negatively affected by losing a parent to divorce than by the tension that leads to the breakup, and B, children's math scores drop after a divorce but reading and other skills do not suffer. As far as who participated, I heard that 3-year-olds and so on were the participants, though I am not certain how many of them participated. I also don't know who conducted the study, who, if anyone, provided funding for the study, when the data were collected, and so on. But if you review the article published in the American Sociological Review, ASR, that reports results of the study, all these questions are answered. You might be saying to yourself, so what? Perhaps you took note that the View coverage does mention that the study was published in the ASR. If you did notice this, then kudos to you. Because the ASR is a peer-reviewed publication of the American Sociological Association, we should have some confidence that the study is reputable. But we still don't hear all the information that might shape what we choose to take. Kim, H.S. 2011. Consequences of Parental Divorce for Child Development. American Sociological Review, 76, 487-511. Chapter 14 250. Away from this study. For example, a review of the ASR article will tell us that the data come from a sample of people who were in kindergarten from 1998 to 1999. Perhaps that is of little consequence, but we might wish to pause to consider whether or how our cultural social context has shifted since 1998 and how that might impact how kindergartners today respond to parental divorce. I am not at all suggesting that only Studies whose data are seconds or days old hold value. If that were the case, I'd say we can safely disregard any of my own publications. Instead, I want to call your attention to some of the questions you might ask yourself as a responsible consumer of research. In addition to all the times that sociological research does make the news, there are also instances when it does not but probably should. In June 2011, for example, an article on children as gender nonconformity appeared in the New York Times. Hoffman said the article took the perspective that children as expressions of gender were natural and biologically ingrained. While we cannot say for certain that this isn't true, we do know from many years of reputable and highly regarded research by sociologists of gender that gender norms and behaviors are in many cases constructed socially, not biologically. That the article omits this perspective and the voices of sociologists who do research in this area is unfortunate, both for New York Times readers and for sociology. Keeping in mind your knowledge about sociology and sociological research the next time you come across descriptions of sociological research in various media outlets, ask yourself some questions about the research you encounter. E. Where do you see sociological research described? How is it described? 3. What information is present, and what is missing from the media account of sociological research? 4. How and where might you access the details that are missing? Keep an eye out for the absence of sociological research as well and consider the following. E. Are there programs or news stories that might be well served to incorporate sociological research findings? How might the inclusion of sociological research shift the story? By asking yourself these questions as you go about your daily routine, you will have integrated sociological research into your everyday life. Key takeaways. Media reports of sociological research, while important, may leave key questions about the research unanswered. When reading media reports of sociological research, it is useful to follow up your reading by checking the original scholarly source in which the research is reported. 3. Hoffman, J. 2011 June 10. Boys will be boys. Not in these families. New York Times. Retrieved from http://www. newyorktimes.com/06/06/fashion/new challenge for parents children's gender roles. html page wanted 等于 O 251 exercises. E. Find a report of scholarly research in a non-scholarly source other than a newspaper. What would you say are the key takeaways reported by the non-scholarly source? Find and read a scholarly source's report of the same research. What would you say are the key takeaways reported by the scholarly source? How do the takeaways from each source differ? How are they similar? How has your own understanding of the work changed by reading the scholarly report? Find a news story that you think could have been strengthened by the inclusion of sociological research. How might the inclusion of sociological research shift the story? 14年1月4日 Sociological research, it is everywhere. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http://Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Learning Objectives 1. Identify locations where we might find examples of sociology and sociological research. 2. Describe how having a background in sociological research methods is useful for our everyday encounters with sociology. A few years ago, I was at home minding my own business and watching one of my favorite shows, Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, when sociology made an appearance. The episode, as I recall, centered on a child who was bullied at school because she had two mothers. In the show, the lawyers discuss research on parenting that was published in the American Sociological Review. 4. It is amazing where and how often you might discover sociology rearing its head when you begin to pay attention, look for it, and listen for it. The benefit of having knowledge about sociological research methods is that when sociology does appear in your everyday life, you'll be better equipped to understand those brief mentions than you would be without some background in research methods. Sometimes we might come across sociological research and not even realize it. As you've seen in the examples described throughout this chapter, there are opportunities every day to encounter sociological research, or, at the very least, its effects. Remember our discussion of the Walmart case in Introduction, page 3. As you may recall, Professor William Bilby testified as a sociologist on behalf of the plaintiffs in the case. The Walmart case is a great example of sociology playing a role. 4. While my search uncovered that the episode to which I am referring originally aired on NBC on December 5, 2005, I have not been able to unearth the article to which the show's characters refer. The American Sociological Association does note, however, Law and Order, Special Victims Unit's mention of the journal on its website, http://www.asnet.org/news/2005.cfm Chapter 14 252. In matters of everyday life, even when we may not realize it, sociologists have participated as expert witnesses in numerous other cases as well. As a sociologist who studies workplace harassment, I was once called upon to offer the sociological perspective in sexual harassment suit. Professor Emeritus Louis Yablonsky, 2002, has been involved in more than 50 cases, providing his expert sociological opinion on cases involving homicide and other forms of violence. In addition to offering their expert testimony in court cases and lawsuits, sociologists also play a role in shaping social policy. Professor Valerie Jenis, for example, has consulted with the state of California to help craft corrections policies there, particularly those focused on transgender inmates, sexual assault in correctional facilities, and hate crime statute implementation. http://www.asnet.org/about/ awards/public/jenis.cfm Professor Diane Vaughn, an organizational sociologist, participated in the investigation following the Space Shuttle Columbia's disintegration. During re-entry in 2003, Vaughn's sociological perspective added a social dimension to the investigation and helped identify the social and cultural factors at NASA that contributed to the Columbia's demise. http://www.asnet.org/awards/public/Vaughan.cfn. Finally, Dr. Darlene Iskral's research had a dramatic impact on national policy. http://www.asnet.org/awards/public/seagull.cfn. When her work on gender discrimination in the military led to legislation that eliminated unequal requirements for men and women personnel serving in Saudi Arabia. What is a trailblazer? 2011 6. These are just a few of the many examples of how the sociological perspective and sociological researchers have played a role in shaping our policies. 7. Another way that we might inadvertently come across sociology is when we encounter the ever-popular armchair sociologist. Perhaps you've met some of these folks or even played the role yourself a time or two. Armchair sociologists tend to wax poetic about how society is or how various groups of people are without having anything more than anecdotal evidence, or perhaps no evidence at all, to support their sweeping claims. Remember the example from Introduction, page 3, about a friend who once proclaimed that all men lie all the time. That is a perfect example of armchair sociology. Now that you are equipped with a better understanding of how we know what we know, and in particular how sociologists know what they know, you are well prepared to question the assumptions of the armchair sociologists you meet. And by sharing with others what you know about how we know things, perhaps you'll even help others break the habit of making unfounded assumptions. Understanding sociological research methods is excellent preparation for questioning the everyday assumptions that others make. And let us face it, we've all probably made some unfounded assumptions about the way the world works or about what other people are like at one time or another. 5. You can read more about the cases that Professor Yablonsky has been involved in the following article he wrote for the American Sociological Association's newsletter in 2002, Yablonsky, L. 2002, January. Sociologists as expert witnesses in the criminal justice system. Footnotes retrieved from http://www.asnet.org/footnotes/Jan02/FN17.html. 6. What is a trailblazer? Dr. Darlene Iskra, adjunct instructor, sociology, is a Navy pioneer. 2011 July 15. Columbia College. Spotlights retrieved from http://spotlight.chess.edu/what-is-trailblazer.html. 7. A useful source for additional examples is the American Sociological Association's descriptions of past winners of its prestigious Public Understanding of Sociology Award. Those descriptions can be found at http://www.asnet.org/about/awards/public.cfn. 253. Key takeaways. Sociological research appears in many areas of our lives and sometimes in unexpected locations. Having an understanding of sociological research methods can be of benefit in areas of your life outside of the classroom. Exercise 1. Find evidence of sociological research in a location where you did not expect to find it or may not have found it if not deliberately seeking it out. Ask 2 or 3 of your peers to do the same and then swap stories. Where did you find sociology? How did you find it? What relevance does sociology have to the example that you found? How did your knowledge about research methods help you identify or understand the instance of sociology that you found? Chapter 14 254 Chapter 15 Research Methods in the Real World 15.1 Applying what you've learned. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 The examples of sociological research provided throughout this text come from a variety of positions on the basic, public, applied continuum presented in Introduction. Page 3. Some examples came from scholarly, peer-reviewed journal articles, others from public interest magazines, and others from applied settings. Nevertheless, students sometimes walk away from a research course wondering how any of what they've learned applies to their lives today and to their future plans. In this, the final chapter, we explore that question. We'll consider the variety of locations where research might crop up in your real-world life. For some, research might be a career. For others, perhaps research will provide a means to become engaged in social change efforts. For all of us, I hope that public sociology will present itself from time to time, perhaps in our reading, our web surfing, our television viewing, or our conversations with others. At the end of this chapter, we'll remind ourselves of some of the answers to the why should I care question that we addressed at the beginning of this text. I hope that by now you have your own ideas about how you might answer that question, but I'll nevertheless remind you of the answers that we've already covered and provide a few others that perhaps hadn't occurred to you. 15年1月1日 Doing research for a living. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Learning Objectives 1. Identify the areas outside of academia where sociologists are most commonly employed. 2. Define evaluation research and provide an example of it. 3. Describe the work of a market researcher. 4. Describe what sociologists working in policy and other government research do. There are a variety of employers who hire social researchers. These include, but are not necessarily limited to, market research firms, corporations, public relations and communications firms, academic institutions, think tanks and other private research firms, public research firms and policy groups, and all levels of government. Some businesses hire social researchers to assist with personnel selection. Many universities 255 hire social researchers for their research institutes, and other firms such as Gallup, http://www.gallup.com/home.aspx and Nielsen http://www.nielsen.com/us/and.html Hire social researchers to examine societal trends. The areas where sociologists holding undergraduate degrees in research are most likely to find employment as researchers are in evaluation research, market research, and government research. Each of these represents a particular use of research rather than a research method. Per se. Evaluation, market, and government researchers may use any of the data collection or analysis strategies we described in survey research, a quantitative technique, page 132, and other methods of data collection and analysis, page 220, but their purpose and aims may differ. We'll explore each of these different uses of social scientific research methods in the following. 15年1月1日Evaluation Research. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http://. Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 As you may recall from the definition provided in Introduction, page 3, evaluation. Research is research that is conducted to assess the effects of specific programs or policies. Evaluation research is often used when some form of social intervention is planned, such as welfare reform or school curriculum change. It might be used to assess the extent to which intervention is necessary by attempting to define and diagnose social problems, and it might also be used to understand whether applied interventions have had their intended consequences. Let us consider a couple of specific examples of evaluation research to better understand how and when it is employed. In Introduction, page 3, I mentioned my experience conducting evaluation research with a transitional housing program. Among other services, workers at the transitional housing locations counseled residents on finding and maintaining employment. 1. Purpose of the evaluation research therefore was to determine whether residents felt they were able to transition successfully back into their communities after a period of institutionalization by obtaining employment that could sustain a life outside of the transitional housing site. This outcomes assessment was conducted in order to determine whether the jobs counseling provided by the transitional housing employees produced the desired goal of preparing residents for finding and maintaining employment. My first experience with evaluation research occurred during my senior year of college. That year, I conducted an internship at a hospital development office. My main task as an intern was to help the office assess how effective it had been in the preceding years in meeting its goal of raising local awareness of and support for the hospital. Using interview research methodology, I collected data from hospital employees and board members as well as members of the local community to learn about what people knew about the hospital, its development office, and the hospital as services and needs. This project culminated in written report and a final presentation. For example, see University of Washington's Social Development Research Group, http://www.sdrg.org/University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill S. Carolina Population Center, http://www.cpc.unc.edu/Penn State S Survey Research Center, http://www.3.psu.edu/Survey University of Nebraska S Public Policy Center, http://ppc.onl.edu/n University of Minnesota S Immigration History Research Center, http://www.irk.on.edu/to name just a few. Chapter 15 256. To several members of the hospital board in which I am the development office director outlined several recommendations for future development office activities, based on the feedback provided by the people I had interviewed. Being able to apply what I learned in my research methods class to a real-world problem and solutions was an invaluable experience. Not only that, while gaining this experience I was able to contribute to the well-being of my community by helping a needed local resource. The hospital find ways to improve its relationship with the community. Perhaps you could look for similar opportunities in your community. Of course, this specific example isn't one of doing research for a living, as suggested by this section's title. But it certainly gave me an experience worth noting on my resume and got me in the door of several potential employers for interviews when I began looking for jobs. There are many other instances of applied evaluation research conducted by social scientists who are employed by firms for their skills as researchers. Just Google the phrase evaluation research firm and you'll find scores of examples. Different firms may specialize in different areas of research. For example, Hoffman Clark & Associates, a California-based firm, specializes in public health and K-12 education assessment. http://www.hoffmanclark.org/index.php Arizona firm Lacroix and Milligan Associates, Inc. conducts evaluation research in the areas of criminal justice and health and human services. http://www.lacroixmilligan.com/index.html In Colorado, Outcomes, Inc. focuses on children and families. http://www.outcomescolorado.com/home Wilder Research, based in Minnesota, conducts evaluation research designed to help strengthen families and their communities. http://www.wilder.org/research.0.html Massachusetts firm Social Science Research and Evaluation Inc. specializes in, among other areas, evaluation research on highway safety and transportation. http://www.3org/index.html Finally, Inventivo Design LLC in Colorado tailors its evaluation research services to corporations wishing to assess whether their investments meet the goals of management and deliver on objectives. http://www.inventivo.com As you can see from this very limited sampling of evaluation research firms, employment as an evaluation researcher could take you to just about any area of the country and involve work with any number of industries and sectors.
15年1月1日2 Market Research.
Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Market research is another way that you might engage in social scientific research to make a living. Just as with evaluation research, market research is not a particular research method per se. Instead, it is a particular way of utilizing research methodology for a particular purpose. Market research is research that is conducted for the purpose of guiding businesses and other organizations as they make decisions about how best to sell, improve, or promote a product or service. This sort of research might involve gathering data from and about one's core market and customers, about competitors, or about an industry more generally. Market research occurs in a variety of settings and institutions. Some firms specialize in market research specifically and are hired by others who wish to learn more about how to best promote or sell a product or service. Market research might also be conducted in-house, perhaps by
257
large businesses that sell products or by non-profits that wish to better understand how best to meet the needs of their clientele or promote their services. Market researchers assess how best to sell, improve, or promote a product by gathering data about that product as consumers. Understanding consumers' preferences, tastes, attitudes, and behaviors can help point an organization in the right direction in its effort to reach and appeal to consumers. There are many ways to do this. You could observe customers in a store to watch which displays draw them in, and which they ignore. You could administer a survey to assess consumers' satisfaction with a good or service. You could conduct covert observations by being a secret shopper or dining someplace as though you, the researcher, are a real customer. You could conduct focus groups with consumers. As you already know from reading this text, social scientific research is an excellent way to gauge people's preferences, tastes, attitudes, and behaviors. Each of these market research methods requires knowledge and skills in collecting data from human subjects, the very thing that sociological researchers do. In the preceding section, I identified just a small sampling of the many evaluation research firms that exist throughout the United States. There are also many firms that exist for the sole purpose of carrying out market research, all of which hire individuals who have a background in or knowledge about social scientific research methodology. Market research firms specialize in all kinds of areas. For example, Arbitron Inc. focuses on media, gathering data about radio audiences around the globe, http://www.arbitron.com/home/content.stm From Maine, Market Decisions conducts market research on a wide variety of topics from public policy to branding to feasibility, http://www.marketdecisions.com/index.php Nielsen, a company many are familiar with, conducts media research of all kinds, http://www.nielsen.com/us/n HTML, but is perhaps best known for its ratings of television programming in the United States. http://www.nielsen.com/us/top10s/television.html Specializing in the area of information technology, Gartner collects data to help its clients make IT-related decisions. http://www.gartner.com/technology/home.jsp These are just a few of the many potential market research employers that seek individuals with research skills. 15年1月1日3 Policy and other government research. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 4.0 International License, http://Creative Commons org/licenses/ by NC-SA/4.0/ Finally, many social science researchers do policy and other government-related kinds of work. In fact, the federal government is one of the largest employers of applied social science researchers. Government and policy research could be in any number of areas. For example, nonpartisan private firms such as Child Trends, http://www.childtrends.org/index.cfm, conduct research that is specifically intended to be useful for policymakers. In the case of Child Trends, researchers aim to improve the lives of children by conducting high-quality research and sharing it with the people and institutions whose decisions and actions affect children. http://www.childtrends.org/cat disp-page.cfm lit等于124. Other private firms, such as Belden Rossonello and Stewart. Chapter 15 258. Conduct research aimed at helping create social change, including projects on biodiversity, education, and energy use. http://www.perspol.com/index.htm As for government work, Contexts magazine recently published an article featuring 4 sociological researchers to whom President Obama's administration has turned, relying on their unique understanding of American society to apply the most relevant research to policy making. 2010 p. 14. Those researchers include James P. Lynch, Bureau of Justice Statistics Director, John Loeb, Director of the National Institute of Justice, Robert M. Groves, U.S. Census Bureau Director, and David Harris, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Services Policy in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Key takeaway: sociologists are employed in many arenas. Some of the most common include evaluation research, market research, and policy, and other government research. Exercise E. If you're interested in hearing more from sociologists who do research, or sociology more generally, for a living, check out Context's article on embedded sociologists, Nizes, Shannon, Heisa, and McElrath, 2011-3, who work in fields as diverse as epidemiology to housing rights to human resources. The article can be found online at http://contexts.org/articles/spring-2011-embedded sociologists/15年1月2日 doing research for a cause. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-like 4.0 International License, http://. Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Learning Objectives 1. Define and provide at least one example of action research. 2. Define stakeholders. Some sociologists engage in research for reasons in addition to or aside from career motivations. These individuals might conduct some form of action research, while action research may be conducted as part of a person's paid employment, as described in Doing Research for a Living, page 255. You might also conduct action research as a volunteer working for a cause that you find worthy. If you've discovered that you have an interest in sociological research but would rather not pursue a career in research, perhaps some volunteer involvement in action is for you. 2. Working for the G-Men 2010 Fall Contexts 9-14-15 3. Nizas, H. Shannon, S. Heisler, K. N. McElrath, S.M. 2011 Embedded Sociologists Contexts 10-44-50 259 Action research, sometimes referred to as participatory action research, is defined as research that is conducted for the purpose of creating some form of social change. When conducting action research, scholars collaborate with community stakeholders at all stages of the research process with the aim of producing results that will be usable in the community and by scientists. On the continuum of basic to applied research, action research is very far on the applied end of the spectrum. Sociologists who engage in this form of research never just go it alone, instead, they collaborate with the people who are affected by the research. Christine Esterberg puts it quite eloquently when she says, at heart, all action researchers are concerned that research not simply contribute to knowledge but also lead to positive changes in people's lives. 2002 p. 137 4. Action research was first developed in the 1960s and 1970s, Freire, 1970 5, for the purpose of empowering individuals in underdeveloped nations, Reason, 1994 6. Since then, action research has become increasingly popular among scholars who wish for their work to have tangible outcomes that benefit the groups that they study. There are many excellent examples of action research. Some of these focus solely on arriving at useful outcomes for the communities upon which and with whom research is conducted. Other action research projects result in some new knowledge that has a practical application and purpose in addition to the creation of knowledge for basic scientific purposes. A search using the key term action research in sociological abstracts will yield a number of examples of the latter type. One example of action research can be seen in Fred Piercy and colleagues, Piercy, Franz, Donaldson, and Richard, 2011 work with farmers in Virginia, Tennessee, and Louisiana. Together with farmers in these states, the researchers conducted focus groups to understand how farmers learn new information about farming. Ultimately, the aim of this study was to develop more meaningful ways to communicate information to farmers about sustainable agriculture. This improved communication, the researchers and farmers believed, would benefit not just researchers interested in the topic but also farmers and their communities. Farmers and researchers were both involved in all aspects of the research, from designing the project and determining focus group questions to conducting the focus groups and finally to analyzing data and disseminating findings. Many additional examples of action research can be found at Loyola University, Chicago's Center for Urban Research and Learning, CURL, http://www.luke.edu/CURL/, index /HTML. At the center, researchers seek to promote equality and to improve people's lives in communities throughout the Chicago metropolitan region. For example, in 2006, researchers at CURL embarked on a project to assess the impact on small, local retailers of new Walmart stores entering urban areas. Jones, 2008. The study found that, while the effect of Walmart on local retailers seems to have a larger impact in rural areas, Chicago area local retailers did not experience as dramatic an impact. Nevertheless, a small but statistically significant relationship was found between Walmart's arrival in the city and local retailers closing their doors. This N. 4. Esterberg, K.G. 2002. Qualitative Methods in Social Research. Boston, M.A., McGraw-Hill. 5. Freyer, P. 1970. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Enviromos, Trends. New York, N.Y., Herder and Herder. 6. Reason, P. 1994. Participation in Human Inquiry. London, UK, Sage. 7. Piercy, F.P., Franz, N., Donaldson, J.L., and Richard, R.F. 2011. Consistency and Change in Participatory Action Research. Reflections on a Focus Group Study about How Farmers Learn. The Qualitative Report, 16, 820-829. 8. Jones, S.M. 2008, May 13. Cities May Mute Effect of Walmart. Chicago Tribune. Chapter 15 260. Other research conducted by CURL aims to raise awareness about and promote positive social change around issues affecting the lives of people in the Chicago area. CURL meets this aim by collaborating with members of the community to shape a research agenda, collect and analyze data, and disseminate results. Perhaps one of the most unique and rewarding aspects of engaging in action research is that it is often interdisciplinary. Action research projects might bring together researchers from any number of disciplines, from the social sciences, such as sociology, political science, and psychology, to an assortment of physical and natural sciences, such as biology and chemistry, to engineering, philosophy, and history, to name just a few. One recent example of this kind of interdisciplinary action research can be seen in the University of Maine's Sustainability Solutions Initiative, SSI, http:// www.uman.edu/sustainability-solutions-index.htm. This initiative unites researchers from across campus together with local community members to connect knowledge with action in ways that promote strong economies, vibrant communities, and healthy ecosystems in and beyond Maine. The knowledge-action connection is essential to SSI's mission, and the collaboration between community stakeholders and researchers is crucial to maintaining that connection. SSI is a relatively new effort. Stay tuned to the SSI website to follow how this collaborative action research initiative develops. Anyone interested in social change can benefit from having some understanding of social scientific research methods. The knowledge you've gained from your methods course can be put to good use even if you don't have an interest in pursuing a career in research. As a member of a community, perhaps you will find that the opportunity to engage in action research presents itself to you one day, and your background in research methodology will no doubt assist you and your collaborators in your effort to make life better for yourself and those who share your interests, circumstances, or geographic region. Key takeaways. Action research is conducted by researchers who wish to create some form of social change. Action research is often conducted by teams of interdisciplinary researchers. Exercise. If you're interested in learning more about action research, or perhaps reading some specific examples of action research, check out the journal Gateways. It is a free, electronic, peer-reviewed scholarly journal focused on community-engaged research. Here is the link: http://www.look.edu/car/index.html 261 15年1月3日 Public Sociology. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http://Creative Commons org/licenses/ by NC-SA/4.0 Learning Objective. Identify and describe at least 2 examples of public sociology. In Introduction, page 3, we discussed public sociology and its place on the continuum of applied, basic research. One of the most delightful consequences of the trend toward public sociology is that the discipline has become more visible and more accessible to much broader audiences than perhaps ever before. But even with the increased accessibility of sociological research, you'll find that having a basic understanding of how sociologists conduct research, which you've gained from this text, is beneficial. In this section, we'll take a look at a few recent examples of public sociology and examine how your background in sociological research methods can help you read, make sense of, discuss, and even share the findings you come across. In recent months, I've been interviewed by a journalist writing for a website run by Dr. Mehmet Oz of the Dr. Oz Show, http://www.ubeauty.com, and another writing for a website dedicated to any and everything having to do with video games and geek culture, http://www.unwinnable.com. Inspired by the fall 2011 television programming lineup in the United States, in particular 2 new shows, including one featuring Playboy bunnies and the other focused on the experiences of early pen and flight attendants. The ubeauty.com interview focused on how expressions of gender, workplace norms, and harassment have changed in the past few decades. The other interview, conducted for an article on how heroism has changed since September 11, 2001, Bannon, 2011, I was asked questions about patterns of social change. In both cases I was doing public sociology, drawing from my own background and knowledge about the sociological perspective on human behavior to help make sense of recent and current trends in society. Many other sociologists engage in public sociology as well. Professor Pepper Schwartz, whose name you might recall from beginning a research project, page 50, is perhaps one of the most recognized public sociologists. In beginning a research project, page 50, I mentioned Schwartz's role as the relationship expert for the dating website perfectmatch.com. Schwartz is also the sex and relationship expert for the American Association for Retired Persons, for whom she writes a regular column, offering advice to those aged 50 and up. Her participation with these venues enables Schwartz to provide relevant sociological understanding, perspective, and knowledge to broad audiences. Another example of public sociology can be seen in Professor Nikki Jones's work. Jones, an urban ethnographer who studies adolescent girls' violence, has found that you can read the final article at http://www.upt.com/relationships/the-secret-to success, good grooming. Interestingly, while the single quote attributed to me is accurate, the context within which I made the remark is not provided. One important caution for sociologists who choose to participate in press interviews is that your perspective may not always be represented in a way that you did choose. 10. Bannon, B. 2011 July 19. Superheroes in a post-9/11 society. Unwinnable. Retrieved from http://www.unwinnable.com/ 2011-07-29 Superheroes in a post-9/11 society. Chapter 15 262. The mean girl phenomenon represented in so much of our popular culture and so many news stories today is far more hype than reality. Chesney, Lind and Jones, 2010. Jones, 2009. In an effort to promote a better understanding of this and other matters of public interest upon which sociological and other scholarly evidence can and should be brought to bear, Jones collaborates with two other editors to maintain the website The Public Intellectual, http://thepublicintellectual.org. The site publishes work by academics and other researchers who write pieces intended to debunk common knowledge on matters of public concern, analyze social policies and problems, and examine cultural trends. Finally, Professors Lisa Wade and Gwen Sharp provide another excellent example of public sociology on their website Sociological Images, http://thesocietypages.org/ Sociimages. The site provides sociological observations and commentary on images of all kinds, from advertisements to charts and graphs, and from around the globe. Their aim is to encourage all kinds of people to exercise and develop their sociological imagination by presenting brief sociological discussions of compelling and timely imagery that spans the breadth of sociological inquiry. The images Wade and Sharp display on the site are chosen for their ability to illustrate sociological ideas in a way that is both compelling and accessible to sociological and non-sociological audiences alike. Peruse their site and SULLC from the comments noted underneath each of the discussion image posts that the sociological images audience runs the gamut in background, ideology, and perspective. In other words, the site accomplishes the exact aim of public sociology, to engage the public. Key takeaways. One of the positive consequences of public sociology is that the discipline has become more visible and more accessible to much broader audiences than in the past. Having a background in sociological research methods can help you read, make sense of, discuss, and share the research findings you encounter. Exercises. E. Check out at least one of the websites mentioned in the preceding section. What do you think of these examples of public sociology? Ask one of your non-sociologist friends to peruse the site. Discuss what you each found compelling. How does your knowledge of sociological research methods shape your understanding of what you read? Discuss public sociology with a few of your sociology peers. In what areas do you think public sociology can and should play a role? 11. Jones, N. 2009. Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence. Piscataway, N.J., Rutgers, Chesney. Linked, M. and Jones, eds. 2010. Fighting for Girls, New Perspectives on Gender and Violence. Albany, NY, SUNY Press.
263 15年1月4日
Revisiting an earlier question, why should we care? Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC SA 4.0 Learning Objectives. E. Define transferable skills. Identify several of the transferable skills you've gained from your understanding of sociological research methods. I hope that by now I've managed to convince you that developing an understanding of how sociologists conduct research has many benefits. On the chance that I haven't done so, or in case you simply want a refresher, let us spend this final section of the final chapter reviewing some of the reasons you might care about research methods.
15年1月4日
Transferable skills. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC SA 4.0 In Introduction, page 3, I suggested that one reason to care about research methods is that knowing how to conduct social science research could lead to a variety of job opportunities. The skills and knowledge you've gained from this text will situate you well for a number of research-oriented positions. Moreover, your background in social science research methodology provides you with a number of transferable skills that will serve you well in any profession you choose. Transferable skills are the conglomeration of tasks that a person develops proficiency in from one realm that can be applied in another realm. Whether you realize it or not, you have gained a host of transferable skills from taking a course in social scientific research methods. Those skills can assist you in your search for employment in a variety of arenas. Perhaps the primary transferable skill you've developed by learning how to conduct social scientific research is an ability to solve problems. Not only that, you are now also better equipped to identify problems. What do social researchers do if not identify social problems and then seek to gain knowledge aimed at understanding and eradicating those problems? Having the ability to seek out problems and the requisite knowledge and tools to begin to solve those problems is crucial in many areas of employment. The investigative skills you've developed as a result of learning how to conduct social scientific research can be put to use in just about any job where taken for granted assumptions are called into question. These might include jobs such as journalism, but work in criminal justice requires investigative skills, as does just about any position that requires one to solve problems, ask questions, and learn new ways of doing things. Related to the problem identification and problem solving skills that you've developed by learning how to conduct social scientific research is another important ability, a talent for asking good questions. Not only is the ability to ask good questions essential. Chapter 15 264 in many areas of employment, and in most areas of life as well, but also this skill is linked to another key area that comes up in research methods courses and is appreciated in many realms, critical thinking. Thinking critically does not mean that someone sits back and criticizes every idea or person that comes her way. Critical thinking is a skill that takes practice to develop. It involves the careful evaluation of assumptions, actions, values, and other factors that influence a particular way of being or doing. It requires an ability to identify both weaknesses and strengths in taken for granted ways of doing things. A person who thinks critically should be able to demonstrate some level of understanding of the varying positions one might take on any given issue, even if he or she does not agree with those positions. Understanding sociological research methods also means having some understanding of how to analyze, synthesize, and interpret information, and having a well-developed ability to carefully take in, think about, and understand the meaning of new information that you are confronted with will serve you well in all varieties of life, circumstance, and employment. In addition, the ability to communicate and clearly express oneself, both in writing and orally, is crucial in all professions. As you practice the tasks described throughout this text, you will attain and improve the oral and written communication skills that so many employers value. Finally, related to the ability to communicate effectively is the ability to effectively frame an argument or presentation. Successfully framing an argument requires not only good communication skills but also strength in the area of listening to others. In sum, the transferable skills you've gained as a result of learning how to conduct social scientific research include the following. E. Identifying problems. Identifying solutions to problems. 3. Investigative skills and techniques. 4. Asking good questions. 5. Framing an argument. 6. Listening. 7. Critical thinking. 8. Analyzing, synthesizing, and interpreting information. 9. Oral and written communication skills. Table 15.1 links each of the identified transferable skills to specific chapters in the text. Transferable skill. Chapters featuring skill, relevant focus. Within chapter. Chapter 2 linking methods with theory. Inductive and deductive approaches. Identifying problems. Chapter 3 beginning a research project. Starting where you are. Table 15.1 transferable skills featured in this text.
265.
Chapter 2 linking methods with theory. How theories and paradigms shape approach. Chapter 5 research design. Identifying solutions to problems. Chapter 7 sampling. Chapter 5 research design, searching for and reviewing the literature. Chapter 6 defining and measuring concepts and Chapter 7 sampling, measurement and sampling. Chapter 8 survey research, a quantitative technique through Chapter 12 other methods of data collection and analysis, data collection, investigative skills and techniques. Chapter 14 reading and understanding, social research, reading reports of research. Chapter 3 research ethics, asking good questions. Chapter 4 beginning a research project. Making questions empirical and sociological. Chapter 8 introduction, ontology and epistemology. Chapter 2 linking methods with theory. Theories. Framing an argument. Chapter 5 research design, hypotheses. Chapter 9 interviews, qualitative and quantitative approaches, conducting interviews. Listening. Chapter 10 field research, a qualitative technique, getting into and establishing rapport. In field. Table 15.1 transferable skills featured in this text. Chapter 15 266. Chapter 12 other methods of data collection and analysis, focus groups, ethnomethodology. Chapter 14 reading and understanding, social research, being responsible consumers of research. Chapter 8 introduction, sources of knowledge. Chapter 2 linking methods with theory. Theories. Chapter 3 research ethics, critical thinking. Chapter 14 reading and understanding, social research, understanding social research. Chapter 5 research design, reviewing the literature. Chapter 8 survey research, a quantitative technique through Chapter 12 other methods of data collection and analysis. Data analysis. Analyzing, synthesizing, and interpreting information. Chapter 14 reading and understanding, social research, reading and understanding, social research. Chapter 13 sharing your work, oral and written communication skills. Chapter 8 introduction through Chapter 15 research methods in the real world, written and oral exercises throughout. Table 15.1 transferable skills featured in this text. 15年1月4日2 Understanding yourself, your circumstances, and your world. Available under Creative Commons, Non-Commercial, Sharia-alike 4.0 International License, http:// Creative Commons org licenses by NC.SA 4.0 Perhaps the most rewarding consequence of understanding social scientific research methods is the ability to gain a better understanding of yourself, your circumstances,
267
and your world. Through the application of social scientific research methods, sociologists have asked and answered many of the world's most pressing questions. Certainly those answers are not always complete, nor are they infallible. But the quest for knowledge and understanding is an ongoing process. As social scientists continue the process of asking questions and seeking answers, perhaps you will choose to participate in that quest now that you have gained some knowledge and skill in how to conduct research. Having thought about what you know and how you know it, as well as what others claim to know and how they know it, I hope it will provide you with some clarity in an often murky world. Whether you choose to adopt the particular ways of knowing described in this text as your preferred ways of knowing is totally up to you. I hope that you will find that the knowledge you've gained here is of use, perhaps in terms of your personal life and interests, in your relationships with others, or in your longer range school or career goals. Key takeaways. Having a background in social science research methodology provides you with a number of transferable skills. Having a background in social science research methodology gives you the opportunity to gain greater insight into yourself, your circumstances, and your world. Exercises. If you're interested in gaining some more research experience, check out the National Science Foundation's Research for Undergraduates (RU) program. The program provides opportunities for students to conduct research at a host institution, along with a small group of undergraduate peers. To learn more about the program and search for current locations hosting RU programs, see the following: http://www.nsf.gov/crsSPRGM/RU/2 Review Table 15.1 Are there transferable skills listed there that you're not yet convinced you've attained? If so, take another look at the cited chapter. Are there transferable skills you feel you've gained that are not listed in the table? If so, what are they and in which chapter are they featured? Chapter 15 268